Hello, Tom again. In this video, it really builds from the last one on cloning. We're going to look at an alternative to using the iClonable interface. Specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to implement methods that are more explicitly either deep copying or shallow copying. So we'll add these two methods, and just to be different, we'll add them as static methods. I'll add a static method called shallow clone to Cartesian point, and a static method called deep clone to the, we'll use the points list class this time. Okay, so to get started, what we'll do is we'll set this up much like we did in the last video. We'll set it up in the main method. So in the previous section, you can comment the read key out, and there is no read key at the bottom of this one. Where it says my second list is a reference, what we'll do is we'll just make a little declaration here. So we'll call it, it's a point list that we're dealing with this time. So point list, my second list, and then equals, and we'll just make it right now equal to the previous my list that we created. So we understand now from the previous video that this is not creating a new object at all. It's just creating a new name for the same object. So if I go ahead and create a new point, I'll do that here. I'll create a new Cartesian point. Let's call it new point. And let's call it 8899. Okay, so that's fine. There's a new point, and then I'm going to try to add that new point to second list. So my second list, and then add the new point. Okay. So far, so good. So then I'm going to ask the question again, does my list contain this new point? Okay, so I've added it to second list. Does it affect my list? So let's look at that. So this is more or less the same code that I used in the previous section. After modification of my second list this time, my list, okay, does or does not contain new point. Okay. And so that'll output that, and then just to verify, here are the actual entries or the points, I should say, currently stored in my list. And I'll just use a for loop this time, using the index as well as the actual point to string. So we'll try running this, see how it goes. Okay, so after modification of my second list, my list does contain 8889. So we can see, yep, my second list and my list are actually the same, occupying the same spot in memory. And just to verify when it outputs it, we can see that it added 8899 at the bottom there. All right. So we solved this problem relative to the points map class in the last video by implementing iClonable. But as I quickly mentioned, iClonable and implementing it is a bit controversial. And the reason being is, again, a lot of programmers feel that it's next to useless to do so because there are important differences between a shallow copy and a deep copy, and there's nothing in the interface that forces you to do one or the other. So there's a number of different ways around that. I could create my own interface. I could create a I shallow clonable and I deep clonable and implement them that way. I'm not going to go quite to that extent, but I will add a couple of static methods. So let's add a static method to the Cartesian point class. Scroll down to the bottom. Okay, and you can see it says a practical alternative to supporting iClonable. All right, we're going to create a new method. It'll be a public method. It'll be static. Okay, Cartesian point. Let's call it shallow clone, or could call it shallow copy too, I suppose. All right. Oh, I need to specify an argument because it's not a member class. By the way, I could have made this a member. that would have worked as well. But I've decided to make it static because I just like the syntax a little bit better. So Cartesian point source, source is going to be what it is that we're trying to actually make a copy of. So all I'm going to do is for a simple class like this, I'm just going to return source dot, and I'm going to use the base objects member-wise clone method, and then just typecast it as a, or I'm not typecasting, I'm using the as keyword as a Cartesian point. Okay, so that's a very simple little method. I'll add a little comment there. Okay, so it's going to create a shallow copy of the Cartesian point we send to it. Okay, I'll save that. And what I want to do is I want to go to point list, and I'll do something similar, okay, which is adding a similar alternative. It'll be called deep clone. So public static, it's going to return a point list, calling it deep clone, and I'm passing in a point list object called source list. That'll be what it is that I'm trying to copy. All right, much the way I did this, I did the clone in point map. I'm going to create a new empty object, in this case a point list object. I'm going to iterate through each point. In this case, not dealing with a string anymore, so it's not a key, but each actual point in source list. And then I'll actually add that point to my new object that I created, copy list. Okay. I'm using the shallow clone static method to make sure that I get a clone of the point rather than just a reference to that point. Okay, so my deep copying and shallow copying are working together. And then finally, I'm going to return the copy list. All right. So the advantage of doing it this way versus just implementing iClonable is, again, my method names. This is really the only difference here. My method names are very explicit about what I'm doing, so a programmer using this class will know whether they're doing a deep copy or a shallow copy for sure. Now, while I'm here in the class, I might as well add a copy constructor because it is or what I'm calling a copy constructor, it is a useful thing to do. So my copy constructor will look very similar to how it looked in the point map class. Okay, so public, the name of the constructor, point list. I'm going to bring in a point list object, and then for each point in the parameter object, I'm adding, I'm using the clone here, but I suppose I could use the same technique I did before using shallow copy. In fact, let's do that. Copy it from here. So I'm not using any of the iClonable stuff in this particular class. Now you notice as soon as I added my copy constructor, it started yelling at me about this line. Okay, and again, that's just because as soon as I make one constructor, I need to make a default constructor. So let's add that. Very straightforward. A public constructor takes no parameters, doesn't do anything. All right, let's save that and we'll go back to main and we'll test this out. Okay, so we'll take this line. I'm going to copy it, comment it out, and paste and modify it here. I want it to be a copy of my list now. All right, so make that modification. Okay, so now my second list is a new point list that's based off of my list. So that's that copy constructor type of technique. I go ahead and run that. Okay, and we can see our output as we would expect now. My list does not contain the new point that we added to my second list because they're two separate objects. All right, and then we'll test out the deep clone method. So point list my second list equals, and then it's a static method, so it's part of the point list class. It's called deep clone, and what is it that I'm trying to clone? I'm trying to clone my list. Okay. So again, I'll run that, and what we should get is a very similar or identical output to the copy constructor version. Okay. All right, so that's doing shallow and deep copying as an alternative um, to the implementing the iClonable clone method. So that wraps up this particular tutorial. Lots of little pieces to it, just skimming the surface though. Hopefully it'll give you a basis for understanding creating your own collection classes in C#. Thank you very much.